Jordan Westburg, his first career walk-off at any level, and the O's win it. We'll recap it all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Tuesday, April 2nd, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we are going to recap a wild walk-off win by the Orioles on Monday night, beating the Royals 6-4 on Jordan Westburg's two-run walk-off homer in the ninth inning. I'll get you the 5 things you need to know from that one, including a big day from Ryan Mountcastle, Dean Kremer's solid outing, and our first sighting of Craig Kimbrell in an Orioles uniform. Then I want to kind of expand on a question I've gotten a couple of times over the past few weeks and months. I talk a lot about options and waivers and DFAs and a lot of roster moves that the Orioles make, but wanted to go further into explaining what they all actually mean. So, when you hear me talk about them later in the season, you know what I'm referring to. That's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast. Before we get there, though, just want to thank you for making Locked On Orioles your first listen of the day. We're free and available on all podcast listening platforms. Make sure to leave a 5-star rating and a review wherever you listen. And of course, like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube page. Going to be a fun season. We saw it last night. I'll have you covered 5 days a week right here on the pod. So make sure you are subscribed wherever you listen, wherever you watch. And we thank you, especially to the everydayers out there. But let's jump into the Orioles win on Monday night. Final score of the series opener against the Kansas City Royals. Orioles 6 and Royals 4 was our final. Jordan Westburg with the walk-off home run to win it. After the O's took 2 of 3 from the Angels over the weekend, they get to 3-1 overall through 4 games this season. And I'm going to get you the 5 things you need to know from the Orioles win over the Royals on Monday night. The first thing you need to know is, Jordan Westburg was the hero in this one. He said after the game, his first career walk-off homer at any level comes in an Oriole uniform to really kick off this 2024 season. And although Westburg was hitting the ball fairly hard on Monday night, I mean, he did have 3 hard hit balls. That was his only hit. And he'd been hitting, now again, it's been, less than 4 games. He'd been hitting under 200 to start the year. Not a super hot start for Westburg at the plate, but you would certainly think that this home run will get Westburg going. And he was down in the count. Runner on first, 1 out, bottom 9 in a 4-4 game. Back-to-back breaking balls from Nick Anderson, the right-hander pitching the 9th for the Royals, gets him ahead 0-2, got a swing and a miss. Then he dropped one in for a strike. And Anderson tried to then blow a fastball by him up and away, but caught too much the plate, and Westburg jumped on it. And that's one of the most impressive parts of Westburg's game as a hitter, the ability to drive the ball the other way. And he drove that fastball out to right center field, just parked it into the seats to the left of the big wall, out there in right field for a 2-run homer. And for Westburg, not just his first ever walk-off homer, but also his first home run of the season, 102 miles an hour off the bat, 369 feet, just enough to get it out at Camden Yards to win the game. And Westburg, maybe the most stoic, generally Orioles player. You don't see a lot of smiles out of him, even though he is, very good friends with a lot of the other Orioles players. But he showed a lot of emotion rounding first base after that homer, and awesome to see for Jordan Westburg. Second thing you need to know from Monday's game is that the other offensive star in this one was Ryan Mountcastle, who was at the plate to drive in 3 of the Orioles' first 4 runs before that Westburg 2-run walk-off homer. And it was Mountcastle who tied the game earlier in this one for the Orioles. They were kind of getting shut down in this game in the first 3 innings by Michael Wacha, the Royals starter. He has had varied levels of success against the Orioles. He's seen the O's a lot in his career. But it's that combo, devastating changeup down, good fastball up. And through the first 3 innings, that was like peak Michael Wacha. He was working it. But the Orioles started to get to him in that 4th inning. Adley Rutschman led it off with a double. Santander brought him home with an RBI single. And then Ryan Mountcastle stepped up and tied the game. Launches one just over the big wall in left field for a 2-run homer off of Wacha in the 4th to tie the game at 3. And Mountcastle, who felt like he had a home run taken away from him the other day on Saturday when he hit one off the wall. This time he got enough of it. 107 off the bat, 408 feet was just enough for a 2-run blast for Mountcastle. And then really he had the ball in play. You could call it a single. You can call it an error. I think it was right to award Mountcastle a single in the 8th inning, but he had the hit that brought in what was in the 8th, the go-ahead run, came up with runners on first and third and 2 outs in a 3-3 game in the 8th and hit a hard ground ball in the hole at short. Bobby Witt made a great play, just a backhand come up, make a strong throw to first. And unfortunately for Witt, Nick Lofton, who had replaced Pasquantino, I believe, at first base later in the game, or maybe he might have been, no, I think he did replace him later in the game at first base, just couldn't pick it out of the dirt. Mountcastle safe, run scored to put the Orioles up 4-3. And a nice looking 3 RBI day for Ryan Mountcastle, who has been productive so far early in this season. You love to see it, productive against lefties as usual, but productive against righties as well, which is huge for Mountcastle. And that was certainly big for his confidence on Monday. And also for Nick Lofton, just a horrendous nightmare inning for him in the 8th inning. It started with, and we'll get to it, striking out with the bases loaded to leave them loaded in the top half. And then he lets a ball from Adley get him to put 2 runners on and then can't pick the ball out that gives the Orioles the lead in the 8th. Not a banner day for the young Kansas City Royal. Third thing you need to know from Monday's win for the O's is that Kremer really had one bad inning en route to a pretty solid 2024 debut for the Orioles' number 4 starter. Dean, who lasted 5 1/3 innings in this one, still kind of building fully up. He went 85 pitches, allowed 3 runs on 3 hits, 5 strikeouts, a walk, and 2 home runs allowed, 6 hit balls by Royals hitters in this one. And Dean was really cruising along in the first 2 innings, scoreless, and then he just threw a meaty fastball on 2-0 to Bobby Witt Jr., who cranked it out the distance. I mean, that solo home run by Witt to put the Royals up 1-0 in the 3rd inning, that thing was smoked. 11 off the bat, 440 feet to dead center to put KC up 1-0. And then he kind of just lost his focus. He walked Vinny Pasquantino on 4 pitches to the next batter. And then Salvador Perez, a guy who chases out of the strike zone really more than anyone in baseball. You don't have to throw him a strike. Dean Kremer threw him a cutter that just caught too much of the plate, and Perez went deep to center for a 2-run homer, and it was a 3-0 lead just like that. Homer, walk, homer in that 3rd inning. But Kremer, kind of similar to what Tyler Wells did on Sunday, gave up the homers, some runs early, and then kind of settled into this game. Scoreless 4th, scoreless 5th, got the first out in the 6th before he came out of the game. I really liked what he was doing with the cutter. Yes, that was the pitch, but the 2 shot to Salvador Perez. Otherwise, he was getting a good amount of swings and misses, 6 whiffs on 12 swings by Royals hitters against that Dean Kremer cutter, which its velocity was actually a little down from last year. It looked like it was moving a little bit more than it did last year at times, which is a good sign for Kremer. Fastball velocity was a little down, but not too much of an issue pitching on April 1st. Thought the curveball looked good, dropped it in there a couple of times, threw some really good changeups early in the game, kind of went away from it later. But overall, I thought a solid performance for Dean Kremer. Only little thing that worried me was when he left the game. Now, he was coming out of the game either way. There was a lefty coming to the plate, had Keegan Aiken ready for the matchup and brought him in. But Kremer kind of like grabbed his left elbow. Now, luckily, not his right elbow, not his pitching elbow. It was the other one. Kind of grabbed it, shook it out a little bit after one of the final pitches he threw in that 6th inning before coming out of the game. Now, the trainers didn't come out and look at him, and the trainers weren't really looking at him when he came back into the dugout in the 6th inning. So not super worried, but just something to monitor for Dean Kremer. 4th thing you need to know from the Orioles' 6-4 win on Monday night is that the Orioles bullpen got some huge outs in this game. And it started with Keegan Aiken, as I mentioned, came in the 6th. It was a 3-3 game, quickly got the final 2 outs of that inning. And then he was able to get himself 2 outs in the 7th, an inning and a 3rd scoreless for Aiken, who has now gone 2 1/3 scoreless to begin the season out of the Oriole bullpen. And he certainly got some help in that inning. Ryan Mountcastle, who was good at the plate, also made a fantastic diving play for the 2nd out of that 7th inning, which basically took away an RBI double from the Royals and kept the game tied at 3. It was a phenomenal play over at first base. But Aiken, despite giving up a couple of hard hit balls in that 7th inning, I thought looked generally like the good version of Keegan Aiken, where he's mixing the fastball and the slider and not giving up, a whole lot of loud contact and getting some swings and misses with the fastball. And in general for Aiken, like, yeah, he looked a lot better in his first outing, but if you can get 4 outs scoreless from Aiken, you're going to take that every single time. And then Yennier Cano came in and he was just awesome. Got a big ground out to strand a runner at third in the 7th. And then he got caught up in just a little bit of trouble. Back-to-back singles to start the 8th. A lot of speed on the bases. Eventually they steal a base. It's 2nd and 3rd with nobody out in a 3-3 game in the 8th inning. And Cano just expertly wiggles out of it, gets Salvador Perez to ground out, holds the runner at third. Very smart move by Brandon Hyde. He then walks the lefty MJ Melendez to load the bases with 1 out and get back-to-back righties up there against Cano. He gets Hunter Renfroe to pop out, and then that at-bat against Nick Lofton with the bases loaded and 2 outs and a tie game in the 8th. I mean, he just went good sinker and then devastating changeup, swing and miss, devastating changeup, swing and miss to get the huge strikeout. Cano did the stare down. He was fired up. Really the first big outs for Cano this season, which are just so fun to watch. And that was pretty cool from Yennier Cano. Now, the 5th and final thing you need to know from the O's win on Monday is that we saw Craig Kimbrell pitch for the first time as an Oriole. Did not get into any of those 3 games over the weekend against the Angels. And he came in for a save opportunity. Orioles got that run in the 8th, led it 4-3 going to the top of the 9th. And Kimbrell blew the save. He did. He gave up a run. Orioles had to go win it in the bottom of the 9th on the Westburg walk-off. But I got to say, as far as blown saves go, that was one of the least concerning blown saves you will ever see. He started the inning with a just absolute paint job fastballs to strike out Nelson Velasquez. Then he got to 2 strikes on Kyle Isbell, and Isbell just fought off a little duck snort bloop single that somehow fell in shallow left field for a 1-out base hit. Kimbrell made a good pitch. Then they went to Dairon Blanco off the bench, who is a great base stealer, super fast. Craig Kimbrell also does not hold runners well. So Blanco steals 2nd and 3rd. And all of a sudden, with 1 out, the tying runs in scoring position. Michael Garcia hits a sac fly to right that scores the run. And then Kimbrell strikes out Bobby Witt on a nasty breaking ball to end the inning. I mean, it was a bloop single and some stolen bases that got him in. It wasn't anything Kimbrell really did wrong. Like, he didn't walk anyone. He looked good. I saw someone say it on Twitter. I believe it was our friend of the show, Ryan Blake, who said that was a very Felix Bautista-esque blown save by Craig Kimbrell. Like, Bautista barely blows saves, but when he does, he lets one runner get on. Generally, it's like a lucky hit, little base hit. And then Bautista, like Kimbrell, he's slow to the plate. He just doesn't hold runners well. So guys will steal bases on him, and then you just need a little more luck to get that run home. Kimbrell is not going to be Bautista. No one is. But I don't think this blown save should really concern you. The stuff looked good. He just got very unlucky. And shout out to the Orioles. Shout out to Jordan Westburg for picking up Kimbrell, hitting the walk-off homer, and getting the win for the O's to open the series. And it continues the streak for the O's of not being swept in regular season series. But the Orioles win the game, open up this series 1-0 against the Royals, and did not make any roster moves on Monday, but did make a few over the weekend. They had Nick Vespi going back and forth. They had Jacob Webb coming back from the paternity list. They had Cionel Perez going on the injured list. So even, 2-3 games into the season, there were already moving parts on the Orioles roster. And I talk about these roster moves a lot with players with options and players on waivers, guys getting DFA'd. But I got a couple of good questions over the past few weeks, just asking to explain this stuff a little bit further. Whether you are very in the weeds with roster moves, you kind of know what's going on, or you're newer to the game of baseball or newer to the game of roster moves in Major League Baseball, the Orioles are going to maximize this roster as much as they can throughout the season as they try to win a World Series. It's always good to know what can they do with these players to help maximize them. So coming up next, I'm going to run through kind of what it looks like to option a player, what it means, how many times a player can be optioned, what the entire outlook of it is, just to kind of be an options and waivers explainer. That is coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Amazon Fire TV. Fire TV is your destination for sports, from live games to highlights to in-depth analysis. Fire TV offers amazing viewing experiences with a smart TV, as well as the Fire TV stick, which I personally love. You can just plug it into your existing TV, and you get access to millions of movies, TV shows, and free and live TV. So the opening weekend for baseball, the college basketball tournament, you're going to want it on a Fire TV. And they've got Fire TV channels now as well that deliver you all the sports you want, including all of us at Locked On. So it's March Madness, it's the NBA, Major League Baseball, and so much more. Check out Fire TV channels on Alexa devices. If you haven't checked them out, you should. Trust me on that one. And to learn more, visit www.amazon.com/LockedOnFireTV. So a big, exciting Orioles win. Jordan Westburg with the walk-off homer as the O's beat the Royals 6-4 in game one of a 3-game set on Monday night. But now I wanted to turn my attention to something certainly less exciting than a Jordan Westburg walk-off home run, but something that's important as you follow along this Orioles team and really any Major League Baseball team throughout the season. It is kind of an explainer on what a lot of these roster moves are that the Orioles make, because they're going to be churning through players at the end of the bullpen, at the end of the bench throughout the year, just as they have done over the last few seasons, which has helped them go from a 100-loss team to a 100-win team in just 2 years. It's depth, it's roster flexibility. Those things help you win a lot of games. And I got a lot of questions about, what do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? So I wanted to start with explaining options. All right. These are very important to a player, whether or not they can go freely back and forth from AAA to the majors. So let's start with this. Teams have essentially two different rosters. Two different rosters. One is the 26-man active roster. Those are the 26 players who are in the dugout with the Orioles, who are active, who are eligible to be placed into a game at any time. Then expanding on that is the 40-man roster. Now, all 26 players are on the 40-man roster, but you can have up to 14 other players on what's called the 40-man roster. Players on the 40-man roster are paid a major league salary, even if some of them are in AAA, those extra 14 players or so. And those players can also be freely sent up to the major leagues. That's kind of the point of the 40-man roster. That's your extra pool of guys who you can easily call on to if somebody's struggling, if you have an injury at the major league level, whatever it may be. Now, once a player finds himself on the 40-man roster, you end up with 3 option years. So why would you end up on the 40-man roster? Well, if you get called up from AAA, you're ready to play in the bigs, you have to be placed on the 40-man roster to then be placed on the active 26-player roster. So for the Orioles, if they were to say call up Jackson Holliday tomorrow, which they're not going to do, unfortunately, Jackson Holliday is currently not on the 40-man roster. So if the O's were to say send down, say they sent down Colton Cowser to bring up Jackson Holliday, they would still need to place Jackson Holliday on the 40-man roster and then place him onto the 26-man active roster because he is currently not on the 40-man at all. However, if the Orioles want to say call up Brian Baker tomorrow because they just wanted to switch out relievers and maybe they wanted to send Jonathan Heasley back down and call up Brian Baker, they wouldn't have to make any room on the 40-man roster. Brian Baker, although he is in AAA Norfolk right now, is currently on the Orioles 40-man roster, which means you don't need to do anything extra. You just call him up, send Heasley down, and there is your roster move. But when you are on that 40-man roster, so generally when you get called up, or a good amount of players will end up on the 40-man roster during the offseason to get protected from the Rule 5 draft. The Rule 5 draft is a draft that's held every December that stops teams basically from holding good players in the minor leagues forever. So once you have been drafted, essentially it's usually about 3 years after you're drafted for college players, 4 years after you're drafted for high school players. If a team hasn't placed you on their 40-man roster yet and basically given you that, hey, here's a big league salary, we think you're big league ready, then you become available to other teams in the Rule 5 draft, and other teams can pick out those prospects from your system. That's how the Orioles got Anthony Santander. That's how the Orioles got Tyler Wells as well to add to their team over the past few years. But if you are a good player, the team will add you to the 40-man roster in the offseason when you're eligible to protect you from the Rule 5 draft. Because once you're on the 40-man, you cannot be selected in the Rule 5 draft. So once you get onto that 40-man roster, however you get there, whether it's a call-up midseason or you're protected in the offseason, you are then given 3 option years. Your first option year is triggered the first time you are sent to AAA. So there are 2 ways this could happen. For Jackson Holliday, for example, say the Orioles called him up tomorrow, right? The Orioles call him up, they place him on the 40-man roster for the first time tomorrow and put him in the big leagues. And then he just really struggles for 2 weeks, and the Orioles send him back or option him back to AAA Norfolk. Once they have done that the first time, that uses up 1 of Jackson Holliday's 3 option years in his career. As long as you go down and spend at least 20 days in AAA, you are given an option year, and that counts as one of the three. Now, the other way it can happen is if you are already on the 40-man roster, but you don't make the opening day roster. For example, someone I just mentioned, Brian Baker. So Brian Baker has been on the Orioles 40-man roster since 2022. He's pitched a good chunk of the last 2 years out of the Oriole bullpen, but he did not make the opening day roster this season. Because he's on the 40-man roster, he gets option to AAA to start and is used as one option year. It doesn't have to be being sent down to AAA during the season. It also counts if you're just sent to AAA to begin the year if you are on the 40-man roster. So Brian Baker lost an option year here in 2024 already because he was sent down one time technically because he went to AAA to begin the season. Now, in an option year, once you've been optioned once, that takes out one of those 3 years. But during the season, you can be optioned back and forth a total of 5 times. Now, it used to be unlimited for players. Once they used up an option year, you could be sent up and down as many times as you wanted throughout a season. But in the new CBA a couple of years ago, to try and stop teams from just yanking pitchers back and forth every other day like the Rays were doing with their relievers, they said, okay, you can only be optioned a maximum of 5 times in a season. So basically, think Nick Vespi each of the last 2 years for the Orioles. And quite frankly, it's going to happen to him again this year. He gets sent down 5 different times during the season and is also called up and then sent down again. And that happened 5 times last year and 5 times the year before. The reason it was 5 is because that is the maximum. If you try to option a player a 6th time in one season, they are then subject to waivers, which means every other team in baseball has a chance to just claim that player and put him on their roster. So that is why the Orioles never optioned Nick Vespi a 6th time in any year, because they still want to obviously hold on to Vespi and not lose him essentially for nothing. So you also may hear me talk about a player being, quote, out of options. That's something I talk about a lot when we were discussing who would make the Orioles opening day roster here on the podcast during spring training. Out of options only pertains to their option years, not necessarily their maximum of 5 options during a season. So, for example, Colton Cowser last year was called up to the big leagues, and then he struggled a bit, and after 6 weeks, remember the Orioles optioned him back down to AAA. Nick Vespi on the other side, remember Cowser basically stayed in AAA for most of the rest of the season, and then they called him up and sent him back down one more time. So Cowser only used 2, or he was only optioned twice last year. Nick Vespi, as I mentioned, was optioned the maximum of 5 times last season. So that's a very different year, right? Option twice, option 5 times. Both of those guys only used up one of their option years in 2024. So as I said, once you've done it once, it's almost like you might as well do it 5 times to continue to use up and maximize that roster flexibility with the options. But a guy being out of options is when he has already exhausted all 3 of those option years. So a good example is 2 guys who were in camp with the Orioles this year. One is Nick Vespi. He is a great example to show how options work. And the other is Ryan McKenna. Nick Vespi is in his final option year because this is his 3rd and final year of options. In 2022, the Orioles sent him back and forth from AAA. That was 1 option year. In 2023, the Orioles did the same thing, back and forth. And in 2024, remember, Vespi made the opening day roster because Jacob Webb went on the paternity list. And then when Webb came back on Saturday, Vespi was optioned to AAA. That means they have already used up his 3rd and final option year. So when we get to spring training of next year, Nick Vespi will officially be out of options, which means the Orioles can't just freely send him to AAA. That was the case for guys like Jacob Webb and Mike Baumann and Ryan McKenna and Tyler Nevin in camp this year with the Orioles. And that's why I would say they are out of options and why it changes their chances to make the team. Now, obviously, Vespi made the team and Webb didn't. But if Jacob Webb's wife didn't have the baby right before opening day, Jacob Webb would have made the team and Nick Vespi would have been the odd man out and would have been sent to AAA. And the reason why the Orioles would have done that is because Jacob Webb is out of options. He's already been optioned to AAA in 3 different years, but Nick Vespi is not. He has his final option year this year. If a player is out of options, you can't just send them freely down to AAA. As I mentioned before, you have to send them to waivers. So if you want to send a player who's out of options to AAA, they have to go to waivers first. And what that means is they are available to every other 29 baseball teams. And those teams have a chance to just pluck that player right away and keep them on their team. So that is why you usually see more guys who are out of options make the opening day roster instead of guys who have options, because Nick Vespi, if he's sent down, well, he just stays in the organization. We can call him up later. Webb, if he's sent down, we lose him without ever actually really seeing what he could do for us this year. Those are the differences between those two things. Ryan McKenna, for example, came up in 2021, was sent up and down a couple of times, came back in 2022, sent up and down a couple of times, came back in 2023, sent up and down a couple of times. McKenna, in the last 3 years, exhausted all 3 of his option years, which meant he came into this season out of options for the Orioles. So they had to make a tougher decision really on Ryan McKenna this year. And usually it makes it a little easier for a player to make the team if they are out of options. Didn't for McKenna, but it did for guys like Jacob Webb and for Mike Baumann this year as well. Now, some players, they never get optioned. Gunnar Henderson came up. He's so good. He's never getting sent back down to AAA. So you might think for those players, okay, do they go their whole career with still those 3 option years where a team, 5 years from now could just freely send him to AAA? Not exactly. For those players who are that good and just like never go back down to AAA once they get called up to the big leagues, those players get protection once they have accrued 5 years of MLB service time. So essentially, once you've been in the big leagues for 5 years, you also can no longer be optioned. You would have to go through waivers. So it basically rewards guys who are good enough that they never get sent back down to say, hey, you're not going to get screwed in your 6th or 7th year. If you're having a little bit of an issue at the plate, the team just can't send you back to AAA and take away your major league salary, right? Like you can stay in you can stay in the big leagues, I should say, if you've been this good for this long. And the other thing that plays in here is option timing. And this is something that came into play in the new CBA as well a couple of years ago. And this is what trips people up a lot. So if a position player is optioned to AAA, that player cannot return to the big leagues for another 10 days. The reason why this rule is in place is to stop teams like the Rays who are doing it from just sending guys up and down, up and down, up and down every other day and basically just thwarting the rules a little bit on the roster. So, for example, if the Orioles felt Colton Cowser was struggling right now and they sent him down to AAA tomorrow, Cowser could not be called up until April 13th. They would have to wait 10 more days to call him back up. For pitchers, it's even longer. Pitchers have to wait 15 days once they are optioned until they can be recalled. But here's the thing that gets lost. There are ways to get a pitcher back to the big leagues before those 15 days. So, for example, Nick Vespi was optioned by the Orioles back to AAA on Saturday. Theoretically, the Orioles would have to waited 15 days to call him back up to the big leagues. Would have had to wait until April 14th. However, there are 2 loopholes in the system. One is if you play a doubleheader. There's a chance the Orioles might play a doubleheader tomorrow because this game tonight is looking like it's in danger. If you play a doubleheader, you are awarded an extra 27th player put on your roster for the 2 games in one day. That pitcher who was optioned 2 days ago is allowed to come up before the 15 days as long as they are only the 27th man and then are sent right back down after the doubleheader ends. The other way a pitcher or a position player can come up before those 15 days are over is if another player gets injured, gets put on the injured list, and that option player is directly replacing them. So, for example, on Sunday, the Orioles theoretically could have called Nick Vespi right back up to the big leagues because they optioned him Saturday to make room for Jacob Webb. And then on Sunday, they placed Cionel Perez on the 15-day injured list. Because Vespi would have been replacing Perez directly for an injury, they could have recalled Vespi that early. But if those things don't happen, position players have to wait 10 days and pitchers 15 days. So that's my best look for you at options. But I wanted to talk a little bit about waivers as well and talk about which Orioles players are available for options and for waivers on the team right now. We'll get to that to finish off the pod coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by FanDuel. The sports calendar right now is loaded, and FanDuel's making it even more exciting to get in on the action because right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 you can use to bet the tournament, MLB, NBA, NHL, and so much more. It's a great time for sports right now. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a big win at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So we just talked a lot about options right now. Wanted to talk about waivers as well. As I mentioned before, once a player has used up those 3 option years, that player becomes out of options. So Mike Baumann and Jacob Webb this year, Nick Vespi next year, as we talked about, Ryan McKenna, Tyler Nevin were in that spot this year. And if a player gets to that point, he either doesn't make, if he gets to that point where he's placed on waivers, he either doesn't make the team out of spring training like Ryan McKenna this year, or a team wants to remove him from the roster during the season because even though he's out of options, he's just not performing well, similar to what happened to Austin Voth at the end of last season. If you have a player that either is out of options in spring training and is not going to make the team, or is out of options during the year and you just want to take off the roster, you designate that player for assignment, or he gets DFA'd, as I'll talk about sometimes on this podcast. And that player gets placed on waivers. The team can no longer just send that player right down to AAA. Instead, that player gets offered up to every other team in baseball. All 29 teams have a chance to claim that player, and it goes in reverse order of record. So the worst team in the league gets the first shot at that player, and then it goes 2, 3, 4 until you get down to the best team in the league to make it a little more fair so the bad teams have the first chance to claim other teams' players. Now, this just stops teams from holding on to players forever and just putting them on the AAA shuttle back and forth. It's like, all right, if you've done that too many times, you've got to put this player on waivers and risk just losing him for nothing. Because if another team claims a player who is out of options, yes, they do have to put him on the 40-man roster and they have to put him on the 26-man active roster, but you claim him basically for free. Like, you don't have to trade for him. You don't have to give anything up for him. You just get him for free on your roster. And that is why teams generally hold on to players who are out of options longer than maybe they should, because they don't want to give them up just for nothing. So a player can just get them on waivers. Now, once that player is on waivers, he can be claimed by another team or can be traded within 7 days. This is something the Orioles did multiple times this offseason. You're the O's, you have a great record, you're very low down in the waiver order. If a player goes on waivers that you like, instead of waiting around for 20 plus other teams to hopefully pass on him, you can jump the waiver order by just offering that team something as a trade. So the Orioles earlier this offseason said, oh, the Tigers have put Tyler Nevin on waivers. We're not going to wait for him. We're just going to say, hey, Tigers, here's some cash. Just trade us Tyler Nevin. That's exactly what they did. It's what the Orioles did with Danny Coulomb to get him before opening day of last year as well. But if a player is claimed by another team, as I said, he's put on that team's 40-man roster, and that is what happened with Tyler Nevin and the Athletics. He was put on their 40-man roster, and because he was out of options, had to be put on their active roster after the Orioles DFA'd him. Now, if a player gets put on waivers but is not out of options, which happens sometimes when you just want to get rid of a player, that player can be sent directly to AAA. Now, there are cases where you still get to keep that player, and that is what happened with Ryan McKenna. He was out of options in spring training. He didn't make the team, so the O's had to DFA him and place him on waivers, but no other team wanted McKenna. So he passed through waivers. All 29 other teams said no, and he was returned to the Orioles. And now that he's cleared waivers, he comes off of the 40-man roster, and the Orioles only then, once every other team has said no, can just place him right in AAA Norfolk. Now, sometimes veteran players who are DFA'd, those are players who have more than 3 years of service time, they are able to refuse the assignment to AAA. Basically, what that means is they say, yeah, no other team wanted me, but I don't want to go to AAA. You have to make me a free agent. That would happen for someone like Tony Kemp. If the Orioles DFA'd Tony Kemp later this season and no one claimed him, he's enough of a veteran to just say, I want to be a free agent instead of go to AAA. But that can't happen for Ryan McKenna. He hasn't been in the big leagues for long enough, so he just goes to AAA Norfolk. So, knowing all that, and I know that was a lot of information to take in on options and waivers, Here's a look at where all the players on the Orioles' current 40-man roster stand. Here are the guys on the 40-man roster with options remaining, aka they're either currently in the big leagues or they are in AAA, but whenever they end up in the big leagues this year, they can be freely sent down to AAA without having to be placed on waivers. Obviously, there's the guys who are not getting optioned this year: Gunnar Henderson, Adley Rutschman, Ryan Mountcastle, Jordan Westburg, Austin Hayes, Cedric Mullins. Like, those guys still have options, but they won't have to worry about it. Then there's other guys where it could come up: Colton Cowser, Ryan O'Hearn, Kyle Stowers, Heston Kjerstad if they get here, Peyton Burdick as well. On the pitching side, also some guys who just most likely won't get optioned: Grayson Rodriguez, Dean Kremer, Tyler Wells, Yennier Cano. Like, those guys have options. They probably won't use them. Then there's other guys where it could be used, like Dylan Tate, Keegan Aiken, Jonathan Heasley, who's currently on the team. And then there's a good amount of other guys on the 40-man who do have options: Brian Baker, Seth Johnson, Matt Crook, Caleb Ort, and Bruce Zimmerman. Felix Bautista also has options, won't come into play because he's missing the whole year. And then when Kyle Bradish comes back, hopefully he does still have options, although you hope he would pitch well enough where the Orioles wouldn't have to use them. And then on the other side, here are the players currently on the Orioles that are out of options, which means if the O's want to get rid of them and they can't find a trade partner, they would have to place them on waivers, DFA them, and subject them to be just plucked out by any other team in baseball. The hitters are Anthony Santander. He won't end up on waivers. But then James McCann, Tony Kemp, Jorge Mateo, and Ramon Arias. So if the Orioles did want to get rid of those guys, they'd have to give them up for nothing. And that is one of the reasons why the O's haven't moved on from Mateo or Arias. And on the pitching side, like, obviously you're not going to DFA Corbin Burns or Craig Kimbrell or John Means when he gets back, or Danny Coulomb because he's been so good. But there's other guys who might hold their roster spots longer than you think if they struggle because they are out of options and would have to go on waivers. That's Cole Irvin, Mike Baumann, Jacob Webb, and CNL Perez all fall into that category for the Orioles. Now, that's a lot to go through. If you still have questions, if I just made more questions for you, I get it. Put them in the comments right here on YouTube. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe as well. And speaking of questions, we're going to do a mailbag episode later this week. So make sure to get in your Orioles questions. You can post them on the YouTube page right here in the comments of this video. You can tweet them at me at Locked On Orioles, or you can email me with your mailbag questions, lockedonorioles@gmail.com. Any thoughts you have about the O's or the show as well can also go to that email address. I will be back tomorrow. Hopefully there's a game to talk about. Weather doesn't look great. If there's not a game, we'll be opening up the mailbag on tomorrow's episode. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.